Well, hey there, you're on the internet, I have some free time, and welcome to the Triple N Network, where all you newbie nib nerds can find all the news you'll need. Let's look at an ink today, shall we? Now, the ink we're going to be looking at today, and for the rest of the week, are inks that I need to re-review, whether because when I first recorded them, I had no actual light, or because my computer was dying so much it couldn't handle more than like 400 frames of whatever, or in the case of this ink, Herbin's clat de Saphir, I'm pretty sure I was given the wrong ink. Now, if you've seen that old review, and if you haven't, please just don't, it's terrible, for more than just having the wrong ink. I admit that I am not the biggest fan of Herbin the brand, and as I say in some of the actual written tests that I'll show you eventually, this is the blue ink that I am probably the most familiar with for the longest. Yeah, so, backstory. I actually have a lot of learning disabilities. I know I've joked in some previous reviews about how I can read about as well backwards as I can forwards, and about being dyslexic, and that's true. But I was given fountain pens kind of like this one, this really cheap, this is a Saphir school pen. You know, kind of like the, the Saphir, like, really cheap calligraphy pens you can still get, but I was given pens like this pretty much as soon as I could learn how to write. They gave it to me to try and, like, teach me how to hold a pen properly and, like, whatever, but it's because I don't have the best small motor skills, as you can probably tell from my handwriting, and I tend to hold pens, like, really close to the, I don't just mean, like, here, I mean, like, here. I tend to just keep scooting forward, and that's why I'm usually covered in ink. So when I was really young, I was given pens like this, cheapo plastic. Being so young, I didn't realize they were refillable, and I would sometimes throw them away. But they took standard cartridges, and so I would get a lot of these, because you could find them in, like, stationery stores or just basic office supply stores downtown. And so Herbin was one of the brands that I'm most familiar with, and they would give me blue because I was in school, and I really wasn't a fan. And then, yeah, so this is probably the ink I have the longest history with, and I'm not a fan. I'm pre-admitting that I've literally tried every single one of the colors that Herbin makes you when you see the big spread thing. Maybe I'll cut it in here. Because people have constantly just given me these tins, and this is the blue I got most often, and they gave me blue most often because, yeah, I'm not the biggest fan. And also, I'm just not a big fan of this color in general, where it's sort of like that standard school blue that hints at purple, as you can see. But my last test, the old one, I'm pretty sure I was given the wrong ink. I think, so I go to the store in Berkeley, California, where they have these giant glass vials. They're like maybe 9 inches long. They're in this big file holder. And they have a swab on top, and the brand label, okay, so this is the old label, but like across the side of the big vial, and you can shake them out and just buy them individually. As I said, I have a long history with this ink. I'm not a big fan, but I needed more ink to review, so I got some, tried to review it. I think somebody probably just like shook the wrong cartridges back into the vial when they decided they didn't want that color or something. So I bought it in good faith, but I think something went wonky. So readdressing it, getting back to it, but in the effort of full disclosure, I did want to admit that I have a long and uncomfortable history with this ink. I'm not a big fan. I will do my best to still represent the ink and its qualities as best I can, but I will, along the way, admit why I'm not the biggest fan of it. That's all. I will try and give it a fair shake. If you don't believe that I have, I do encourage you to leave comments down below, because I don't want this review to be lacking. So if there's something I forget, or you want to express your opinion, I really do encourage that, because I'm definitely, like, the reason why I'm doing this at all is because I firmly believe mo info, mo beta. So the more information there is out there, the more people can, you know, aggregate and then come to a conclusion for themselves. So yeah, here we go. Herbin's Clat de Saphir. Here I have it in sample form. This one I got from Anderson Pens. Again in good faith, but okay, I don't know if you'll be able to see that, but as it's running down the vial, it's actually quite purpley. It's kind of lavender. Can you see that? It's kind of hard to tell with the blue in the background, but when you write with it, it goes down purple. And then it dries to something slightly more blue. Now, two pens I used were these. This is a Pilot Metropolitan with a Japanese fine nib, which is really, really fine. It's almost like writing with the corner of a razor blade. And this Lamy Safari with a broad nib. Can you see that? Yeah, it's already a little bit wet, but yeah. So, comparisons. Now here's Clat de Saphir, and here's Aurora Blue from Platinum. This is from the Mix Free series. As you might be able to tell, and I don't know if the light's going to catch it, but I don't know, it doesn't want to catch it. There's a little bit of red sheen right through here where it's darkest. That's going to be one of those days, isn't it, camera? So as you can tell, it's a bit more saturated. It shades a bit more, and this one has sheen, even when it's not laid down as thick as Clat de Saphir. So it's a little bit richer, maybe a hair darker, but that could be because it's more saturated. Next up is Pelikan's Edelstein Sapphire. Quite close, again, more saturated, maybe just a hair more on the sort of lavender side. Shades quite well. I'm gonna murder this. Hoha und Kleiner Königsblau. This one is maybe a little bit more straight blue. This one is a little bit more purple. And as you can see, it's, well, it shades a lot more, but I think it might be even a little bit thinner, or that could have been me with the knife scraping the paper a bit too hard. But yeah, anyways, there's that. And lastly, Pilot's Namiki Blue. Now this one, I can tell you from experience, is it's denser. Like you see here, we can see the woolliness of this paper. So it's thinner through there, and here where it's thinnest, you don't get that woolliness. It does have a matte finish, but you don't see the texture of the paper like you do here. And here we do have red sheen, but it's not going to show up on camera because it's one of those days. But I think it is the blue with this sort of red sheen that gives it that hint of purple. Well, you can almost see it, but yeah. So there you go, there are your comparisons. Chromatography. So this one on the left, the little D in the corner, that is the one that I let dry, which is not how you're supposed to do it, but I feel like it's taught me some things. Now, as you can see, and actually the camera's darkening this up a bit and making it look just purple. This is a sort of like bright, sort of like Easter purple. I may have to fix this in post. So the way I do this is I draw a line, I dunk this in water, and then when this test is dry, I dunk this in water. So usually about 8 to 10 minutes. Now you can see where the line begins very clearly. And then there's some light purple going upwards, and then we have this very bright, vibrant blue up at the top. Now here, on the one that I let dry, the spot where it was initially put down is darker. I'd say maybe the purple going up is just a little bit thinner. And we have more bright blue at the top, but I also wanted to point this out. It's not quite showing up on camera, but here and here we have something that's almost like it's brighter. It's more like a turquoise or like a robin's egg. And I didn't know if that was a flaw in the paper, or the chromatography paper, so I did it again, and we got the same thing. This right here is some of that robin's egg light blue thing. So I don't know what that's about, but I think it's curious that shows up on the dried sample. So, chemical tests. So, water got it moving, but not as much as a lot of standard blue inks. I will give it that. This ink had more water resistance than I would have thought. Admittedly, last time I was using it regularly, I wasn't testing this stuff. But yeah, I didn't expect that. But as you can see, the water got it moving, but you can see, kind of like the chromatography showed us, there's this purple underneath. So where it was laid on heaviest, there's still some purple. Now, 1/3 bleach solution pretty much obliterated it, but right at the edges and here where it was darkest, you get this, like, it's a different kind of blue, which is rather fascinating, but yeah. Ammonia pen flush got it moving about as much as water, but I don't know if you'll be able to tell, but it started to affect the paper. But there's still a bit of purple left behind. And then hydrogen peroxide, yeah, it really started to affect the paper, as you may be able to tell, especially right there. And it started to break up the purple, but it also started to just break up the paper, so yeah. Speaking of paper, paper test. Clairefontaine, 90 grams per square meter. Now, as I've said in the past, I need more of a guideline than just dots, so I really love quadrilateral paper or graph paper. The downside being that there are more lines, to state the obvious. So for me, a litmus test is whether or not you can see those lines even in the areas where it's laid on heaviest. And here you can, with the exception of right here. That's where it really fades. Now, that's especially kind of sad because this is a light purpley kind of ink, and these are light purple lines. So the fact that it still sort of stands out is rather unfortunate. Now, as I said, this is a litmus test for me, but it also says something to saturation. So as you can see, it can look kind of thin and watery and a bit washed out. But if that doesn't matter to you as much as shading, then you're going to like this ink. There's lots of shading. There's a wide breadth of shading. In fact, we get a little, just a tiny bit, you'll see more of it later, of a dark sort of halo outline around the wettest parts, which generally I like, especially in undersaturated inks, because it provides more contrast, makes it easier to see. But yeah, that Japanese fine nib took 11 seconds to dry. The already kind of wet broad took 23, which surprised me. I thought it would take a bit longer with a Western broad and a admittedly slightly wet flowing ink. But yeah, there's no bleed, no feather, no spread, no echo, no sheen. Quite well behaved in that regard. And then, so that looks largely gone. But then when we bring this over here, if you really like stop and focus, you can see that there was something there. You can read it a bit. It's not going to be the easiest thing in the world, but you can read that. So I would pity the individual who had to recover that, but it could be done. And it didn't dye the page very much, so there's that. Now, next up is Fabriano Eco Qua. It's an 85 gram per square meter paper. I really like it. And yeah, this is so I'd say that Clairefontaine is more of a white paper, and I'd say that Eco Qua is almost more like an ivory. But I feel like you can start to see that lavender quality coming through. But yeah, the Japanese fine took 14 seconds to dry. The already kind of wet broad took 25. But again, that was better than I expected. Now we are getting that light lavender thing going on. It does still appear undersaturated. Again, you can see the dots coming through, even in the wettest parts. But again, that's a personal litmus test. However, here we do get a very distinct dark outline, which is what I call the halo effect, which again I really like because it creates more contrast, makes it easier to see. Now admittedly it does primarily appear in the broad, but I think maybe there are bits of it here in the Japanese fine. It's just the line is so small that's hard to detect. But yeah. So there's that. Again, no bleed, no feather, no spread, no echo, no sheen. But a fairly decent water test. And again, I wasn't expecting this. But again, I didn't test this really when I was a kid. Didn't dye the page much. It did just a little. Again, there's this faint hint. But again, that's a Japanese fine, so And then, you know, where more was put down, more remains, so you can tell which lines and which dots were the broad and which ones were the Japanese fine. But yeah, that would be recoverable. With difficulty, but recoverable. Now, next up is Rhodia, 80 grams per square meter. I feel like lots of people are familiar with this stuff. Yeah, this is, again, I'd say more of a white paper rather than like an ivory. It also has purple grid lines, however, they're a bit lighter. However, they're also a little bit wider, I guess. But this paper does have a ceramic coating added in the pressing process. So we are going to get very, very distinct halo lines. That is something that we get on here, and I hope that comes through. It also looks very lavender on here, and despite the lines being lighter and maybe a bit softer, they are still very, very noticeable even in the scrubby, which for me is unfortunate, but if you are more about the shading and less about the saturation, then you're going to like this. Now the Japanese fine took 12 seconds to dry. The admittedly kind of wet broad took 22, but that's still faster than I expected. And I say here, it looks kind of dusty, because it does. It kind of has like a dusty quality. It's not quite a matte kind of a finish. It's just, it has sort of like a, yeah, it's dusty. That's the best way I can think to describe it. And here I say it's about a 6 out of 10 wetness, adjusting for the Safari, because the Safari is already a little wet. Now there's no bleed, no feather, no spread, no echo, no sheen. But again, fairly decent water test. It didn't completely dye the page. Again, it did, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but the water tests are turning it more purple. So, kind of like we saw in the chromatography. But yeah, here again, that Japanese fine, it left something behind. If you had to recover that, you could. And again, the broad put more down and so more remains. But yeah, so it wouldn't be impossible. Now, next up is Tomoe River. It's famous for drawing out shading and sheen and dry times and echo. And now this paper is a cream colored paper. You can really tell. And I do that because, well, I want sort of a variety of papers so you can tell how the color changes on a different background. And here, this is definitely more of a lavender. It brings out more of the purple. So there's that. And like I said, it draws out shading and sheen, but because of the way the paper makes ink pool, you know, it stretches that bell curve of shading, and so it gets even lighter. Like here where I say it looks, you know, kind of thin and dusty, there are parts of the writing on here where it looks unbelievably thin. Like look at the top of the Z, or the bottom of the A, that D, or in the Japanese fine. But admittedly, we do have extremely like razor sharp and clear halo outline, so there is that contrast, that helps. But again, there's less of it here in the fine, so it's not quite as easy to see. It looks thin and dusty on here quite a bit. But here, I do admit, as I said, this paper's known for drawing out dry times, but the 6 out of 10 wetness ink in an already wet European broad pen, and it took 25 seconds to dry. That surprised me. Like, I've literally seen some inks that have taken 2 minutes to dry on here. That's not common. Usually it's like in the high 30s. But still, that surprised me. The Japanese fine took 16 seconds. Yeah, it looks really light. But anyways, yeah. Good dry times. Now, this paper, because it's so thin, it does tend to echo or have show-through quite a bit, just because it's so thin. However, this is a, you know, so the color isn't light, but because it's moderately saturated, I'm trying really hard to phrase this diplomatically, it doesn't create as much of an echo as most inks would. In fact, that Japanese fine, for the most part, really wouldn't bother people, unless they're really picky. The broad, maybe a little bit, but yeah, because it's not as solid on this side, it doesn't become as obtrusive on the back. But yeah, there's no bleed, no feather, no spread, because this Tomoe River really doesn't do that. There's no sheen, because so the way sheen works usually is that there's enough ink, you know, like the pigment or whatever in the ink dries on top of the paper and sort of stacks and stacks and stacks, and then that's what shines. This, you can stack it on and stack it on and stack it on like I tried to do in the scrubby, but it's so thin that you're not going to get that. You're just not. But yeah, anyways, a lot of times this paper will just ink slide away when you add more water. It didn't. There's actually some that remained. It did dye the page just a bit, and this, actually the camera's darkening that up a bit, but if I like squint and really concentrate, I can see that. This, I don't have to concentrate as much, although parts of it are missing. But yeah, that's really not bad for this paper. I will give it that. So it dried relatively quickly. You're not going to have as much show through, and it won't be completely gone, so. Now, on the next three papers, I just used the Japanese fine, except to write the name. And this is quite possibly the worst paper on earth. Yeah, just really awful, awful paper. It's a 20 pound, sort of like a standard, you know, like inkjet or whatever paper. Now, I don't know if this will come through, but despite the fact that I said that this cream-colored paper really brought out the purple, something about the absorbency of this paper also really brought out the purple. It looks purple. A lot of times with these kind of inks, you know, like whatever, you know, they will just have a hint of purple until you put something really, really blue next to it, and you're like, oh, that actually looks kind of purpley. This one, it actually kind of looks purple. But yeah, anyways, as you can see, we do get spread here on the more absorbent paper. That's really common. We do have a good, come on camera, we do have a good bit of feathering. We do have woolliness. Took 1 second to dry. It sort of sunk into the paper really quick. Yeah, so it doesn't look great behavior-wise. We do have dots of show-through, but very little full-on bleed. Like here a bit in the scrubby, and in the odd dot it starts to come through, but it didn't get onto the page below, so there's that. But this is nice, and this is something we'll see in the more absorbent papers. So more absorbent papers tend to draw the ink in and make it harder to wash out. And that's definitely what happened here. You can really clearly see where it started to wonkify the paper. But it didn't explode and make a mess. That's very clear. You could absolutely recover that. You can also see the blue starting to shoot off the purple a little bit. But yeah, that would be recoverable. That's absolutely recoverable. It's quite clear. I was not expecting that. Now next up is Mead Notebook Paper. It's very common for anyone who went to school in the United States. This is the kind that came out of a spiral notebook, not the kind that came out of the composition kind of notebook. And this kind, admittedly, is quite prone to feathering, but you might be able to see, as compared to the 20 pound, we don't have as much spread. We do have some, but not as much, so sort of a nice medium there. But we do have woolliness. Come on. We do have feathering, which is a problem that this paper has. It took 2 seconds to dry. There's really no shading of any kind. It's still fairly lavenderish, and although we have show-through, bear in mind this paper is physically thinner than 20 pound. We have absolutely no bleed, even here on the broad. We have very clear show-through. You see how it's very light and opaque? That means it never actually made it to the other side of the page. So there's that, which is good because, I mean, it's a Japanese fine pen. It's very fine writing, but yeah, so it could be a lot worse. And this paper tends to freak out when you add water. It didn't. Look at that. It is very clear. It is very there. There's no more feathering or anything than you don't see above. And you can see the blue kind of shooting off a little bit. but that is absolutely recoverable. This would be a very decent pen, paper, and ink combination, especially because we were given these in school for like our chemistry notebooks. There were accidents, so, I mean, I can't say it's like immune to hydrochloric acid, but, you know. So, lastly, is Moleskine notebooks. This paper is expensive, but cheaply made. I hate this stuff. Anyways, yeah, it took 7 seconds to dry. You can see the pulp, the pulp pattern in the paper. It's feathery, it's woolly, it's unattractive. And for a Japanese fine, we actually have a lot of bleed. Now, you remember where I said, like, it's opaque, so it didn't make it to the other side. This, we don't have that. We have lots of very clear dark dots throughout. And actually, on a couple of instances, I guess I forgot to circle them, it actually dotted the page below. And again, this is a Japanese fine. This is the equivalent of a Western extra fine. It is not an overly, it's not, I'd say like the pen's wetness is maybe a 5.5. Like that's, you know, it's a 5. You know, it's very standard. Admittedly, the ink itself is maybe a tiny bit wet flowing, but I mean, when you get this on Mead and you get this on Moleskine, that's just ridiculous. However, I do include these tests because there was a time when I didn't know better. So, now, here's the first time we really see a cheaply made paper freak out in a water test. As you can see, it's starting to like feather and explode, starting to look like Cookie Monster's evil cousin. Yeah, they're starting to like overlap and get fuzzy. I feel like I'm not wearing the right pair of glasses. Yeah, so that would not be a good pen, paper, and ink combination. Mostly because of the paper. I hate Moleskine. Anyway, so there you go. Herbin's Clat de Saphir re-revisited. Admittedly, I didn't make myself watch that last review right before recording, so I can't remember exactly what I said, because I wouldn't want anyone to watch that. It is slightly purpley, which is not a color I super enjoy, the ones that sort of like can't tell if they want to be blue or purple. It is undersaturated, which is not my preference. But it does create a lot of contrast, so if you love shading, it's got that. It's a very standard blue, so if you like that, you got that right there. If you love halo effect, you got plenty of that. It is slightly, just slightly wet writing, so if you have a pen that's a bit reticent, it's got that. It's actually quite, it's on the, you know, it's on the drier, or more quickly drying side of the spectrum, so it's got that. And it behaved in waterproof tests really well on more absorbent cheap papers, so it's got that. It is a perfectly decent ink. Yeah, it's got some things really going for it. It's just not my preference, that's all. Doesn't mean it's a bad ink whatsoever. So yeah, there you go. Herbin's Clat de Saphir. For your consideration from the Triple N Network. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe to the channel. And thanks for watching. Bye.